Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar, Coronavirus and Education Inequality in the US and Japan. My name is Maya Fisher, and I'm Director of Education and Tomodachi Programs here at the US-Japan Council. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few housekeeping items with you to maximize your experience of this evening's program. First, this is on the record and will be recorded. All participants have been muted and your cameras have been turned off. If you would like to ask a question, please use the question and answer box and type in your question. The moderator will get to as many questions as possible and may restate your question for the speakers. When you post your questions into the Q&A box, you may choose to do so anonymously or with your name attached. If your question is selected by the moderator, your question and your name will become public. If you're calling in from a phone rather than zooming in on your computer, you will not have the ability to ask questions. So we encourage you to participate via computer if possible. That is all we have for housekeeping items. So without further ado, let's begin. As I stated earlier, this evening's webinar is titled Coronavirus and Education Inequality in the US and Japan. When I first began organizing this webinar, coronavirus was the primary context for looking at this issue, as the pandemic had revealed pre-existing and long-standing issues of inequality from kindergarten to higher education. As things shifted from in-person to distance learning, the gaps in resources were revealed, and the readiness of institutions to make the shift and the ability of international students to even remain in their host countries brought to light things that educators have known for years. Educational systems are unequal. Opportunity is not equitably distributed. But in the last couple of weeks, the cultural moment in the US and around the world has forced us not only to acknowledge the existence of such inequalities embedded in our systems and institutions, but to do something about it. And hopefully, tonight's discussion will move the needle forward by not only providing new information and perspectives for how to think about these inequalities, but will also inspire you to take action and use your voice to combat inequality and inequity in education when you see it. We're grateful for this opportunity to bring you this important and timely discussion as part of our efforts to connect and share information. Now I'm pleased to introduce the President and CEO of the US-Japan Council, Suzanne Basala.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you so much for that perspective that you shared. At USJC, which was founded by Japanese Americans, our mission is to develop and connect leaders to create a stronger US-Japan relationship. Events like tonight's are focused on bringing together leaders from across backgrounds, sectors, and generations. Our programming has a particular focus on empowering next generation leaders, including ELP or the Emerging Leaders Program. We have several other programs that support access to higher education for those who might otherwise lack opportunities. The Toshizo Watanabe Study Abroad Scholarship Program supports students from both the United States and Japan, as do many of the Tomodachi Scholarship and Study Abroad programs. Our membership and network also extends to diverse faculty and university administrators in both countries. So I'm particularly pleased that today's webinar will highlight key actions leaders at all levels can take to address inequalities in education and to reimagine models of educational success and achievement. Moderating today is Dr. Bill Tsutsui, a USJC board member and alumni of the 2011 Japanese American Leadership Delegation. Dr. Tsutsui is the President Emeritus, Hendrix College, and an award-winning historian and longtime advocate for diversity and inclusion in higher education. Prior to his tenure as president of Hendrix College, he was Dean of Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences at Southern Methodist University, and he taught for 17 years at the University of Kansas. Dr. Tsutsui is a specialist in modern Japanese business, economy, and cultural history with 8 books to his credit. In addition to serving on USJC's board of directors, Bill was recently appointed to the Japan-US Friendship Commission. Bill always has a way of lighting up the room, so I fully expect that he'll find a way to bring that to the virtual setting as he moderates tonight's session. So Bill, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today for what I hope will be a substantive, timely, enlightening, and I suspect at times somewhat uncomfortable discussion. I hope you all will be active participants and bring your voices and questions to this important conversation. Now, as we're all aware, the ongoing global pandemic and its economic repercussions have strained individuals and institutions around the world. In particular, the experience of COVID has starkly revealed the long-standing systemic forms of socioeconomic and racial inequality that societies and governments have for decades either tried to ignore or failed to address effectively. The virus has taken a disproportionate toll on those of low socioeconomic status globally, and in the United States on communities of color, especially African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. The most vulnerable economically have also suffered the most acutely from the daily hazards of working in frontline, high-risk jobs and from pandemic-related employment losses. Although education has often been hailed as the great equalizer, the current crisis has drawn unprecedented attention to how deep and tenacious inequality is in educational systems around the world, and even, or perhaps especially, in some of the most prominent and prestigious institutions. In both the United States and Japan, the public has long been aware of the profound and corrosive impact of socioeconomic, racial, and gender inequality, from countless studies of the learning gap and the achievement gap, from shocking statistics like the 2017 finding that 38 elite US universities had more students from the top 1% than from the entire bottom 60% of the income scale, and from outrageous scandals, including the 2018 revelation from Tokyo Medical University and other Japanese med schools that they had long manipulated test scores to reduce the number of women in their programs. But today, the spotlight being thrown on educational equality and the demands for meaningful systemic change seem more intense and more insistent than they ever have before. For this webinar, we are fortunate to have with us two very accomplished individuals with deep experience in higher education, diversity, equity and inclusion, and international exchange. I'm pleased now to introduce our speakers. Ryohei Nakagawa is Associate Professor at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies and founder of the Department of Global Studies there. An expert in finance and corporate governance in Japan, Ryohei holds degrees from Columbia and Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, has worked for the World Economic IG and numerous Japanese universities, and has been active with the US-Japan Leadership Program and the Tomodachi Initiative at USJC. Daniel Porterfield is currently President and CEO of the Aspen Institute, a nonpartisan forum for values-based leadership and the exchange of ideas. He previously served as president of Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he gained a national reputation for his work increasing social and racial diversity and for being an outspoken advocate for accessibility, inclusion, and equity in higher education. Dan serves on the Board of Trustees of Teach for America, and in 2016 was recognized by the White House as a champion of change for college opportunity. Welcome, Ryohei. Welcome, Dan. And let me ask you, what, from your perspectives, are the key inequities in education that you see uncovered by the coronavirus in the United States and Japan? And Dan, do you want to start us off?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Ryohei. Nice to meet you. Suzanne, thank you. Maya, thank you. It's a big group that's joined in for this meeting of the US-Japan Council, and you have an incredible mission. And I have to say one thing before I answer your question. The Aspen Institute is in partnership with you. We have 11 global Aspens around the world, including Aspen Institute Japan, which has been in existence for more than 20 years, and which runs seminars throughout the country on major questions of values and community. And there's tremendous leaders in Aspen Institute Japan, and we're very proud that that Japan hosts one of the 12 Aspen Institutes in the world. So with that as background, I guess I would say that the coronavirus reveals all of the inequities that we maybe don't think about enough in educational equity, from kindergarten through the PhD in the American system. It doesn't only reveal them, it's worsened them in all kinds of ways, and I won't give a long answer. But whether your focus is little children who go to school in desperate need of making sure they keep up at their academic level and maybe come from impoverished backgrounds and receive social services and food at school, or if your focus is students who have special needs in how they learn, or if your focus is students who are trying to go to school part-time while working, they're a little bit older and in community colleges, or if your focus is students who need financial aid in order to go to college, or for that matter, if you're thinking about students from modest backgrounds who are in graduate school, all of those students have had their circumstances worsen considerably. If the coronavirus has been a terrible setback for all people around the world, it's been an absolute disaster for low-income and moderate-income students in America. Let me just stop there and thank you for your concern, Bill.
Ryohei?
Yes, I just mute. So thank you very much for having this webinar and giving me a chance to share my thoughts and experiences this time. I'm very flattered to share my thoughts. But before sharing my thoughts, first, I'd like to express my heartfelt respect to those people in America striving for fundamental human rights of all. I think we have witnessed so many good, bad, and complicated things around the world in the past several months. And I think the fact that we have this discussion today is very important because education inequality is, of course, one of the fundamental societal problems both in America and Japan and all over the world. And we are shedding light on this issue. So I thank you, Bill, Dan, Suzanne, Maya, and the USJC for organizing such a meaningful event today. And now I'm the only one representing Japan today, at least. Please allow me to focus on the things in Japan and education institution in general, and what I personally have gone through. And living in Japan, I think issues related to social minorities or ethnic minorities particularly do not become open and evident to people's eyes. There's an underlying perception in general, or maybe like a misperception, say, that we live in an ethnically homogeneous community, and therefore people tend to think that we all behave similarly and have similar mindsets. And this is like a social norm in one sense. But in the reality, such social minorities do exist for sure, and they happen here for all the time. And people actually know that, but they often forget. By the way, Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, where I work out, is a small local university college, and has just launched its in April 2018, a new department where working language is 100% English, which is a bit rare still in the Kansai area. And by running this small department where close to half of students come outside of Japan or have like multiple ethnic identities, we're witnessing some shadows and realities of what Japanese society has gone through in the past. And for those listeners today who may not be familiar to the situation of immigrant workers in Japan, please just allow me to talk a little bit about it. Just like any other countries, ethnic minorities in Japan has not been able to adapt to the Japanese education system or assimilate in the Japanese society overall, and which makes them very difficult to earn higher income in the future. This will sort of isolate themselves in Japan and also stabilize their low income level. And one of the major groups is Brazilian Japanese. Since the late 1980s, Japanese manufacturers started inviting many workers from some of the developing countries to reduce their labor costs. But the way they select those immigrant workers was selective. And it was to welcome second or third generation of Japanese immigrants to Brazil or Peru, mostly from the period before and after the World War II. And now the population of Brazilians living in Japan is around 180,000. And another representative, I think, is the Filipino Japanese. And the situation of Filipino Japanese in Japan is a little more complicated. From 1980s until the early 2000s, the government of Japan has been issuing so many visas in the name of the performance visas to so-called singers and dancers, particularly from the Philippines and some from Thailand. And they were mostly females. But in the reality, very many of them were not necessarily singers and dancers. They were working in the nightclubs or sometimes in prostitution. Many of them women are from low-income families in the Philippines and came to Japan through human trafficking gang agents. And some of them married to Japanese men officially, while many others had extramarital children. And some fathers acknowledged those children as theirs, while many others did not, and sometimes disappear. Those children are now aged around high teenagers or up to 30 years old, somewhere in the early 30s. And they live both in Japan and the Philippines. So when we launched our English-based Global Studies Department 2 years ago, the majority of students with non-Japanese identities was not Chinese. It was the students with the Filipino identity. We also have the students with the Brazilian identity and many others. And this department turned out to be the place where students learn about the true meanings of diversity in diversity. And now we as faculty members feel that we have a strong sense of responsibility in bridging those social minority young people to live their decent lives. And now came the corona. And many of the parents and guardians of the social minority students are working under the non-regular status with manual labor or in the hospitality industries. That means many of them are at risk of losing their incomes. So we're trying to support those students by, for example, looking for internal and external scholarship opportunities, as well as asking the college to allow tuition payment deferral. So both the ability to pay tuition and the capacity of having Wi-Fi online environment, those social minority students are facing hardship for sure. And we'll make sure that we work hard to overcome the situation one by one. I think I should stop here to spare some time for the discussion after this. Thank you.
Ryohei, you did a nice job talking about some of the steps being taken in Japan, but I wonder if you can comment a little bit on what institutions and governments can be doing and should be doing in terms of addressing these issues in the short term and over the longer term. Ryohei, do you want to start off on that one?
Okay, thank you. Let me start from the shorter term. Well, of course, education institutions like us and local central governments both should support them financially, either by grants or preferential loans and others. I think the problem is that this kind of policies, we should not treat apples and oranges at the same as same things. because the government, for the case of Japanese government, they're supporting students who lost their part-time jobs or lost the source of incomes because of the corona, up to about US $2,000. But there's some additional conditions to non-Japanese students only, but not to the Japanese students. And they required high GPAs, the higher the academic results. And I think this is not fair, and this is because this is not a scholarship. The objective, according to the Ministry of Education, they said it's the objective is to pay this emergency money as as like Japan's talent acquisition. But this money is supposed to be supporting their livelihoods instead. And so I think we, as government, of course, but of course, as institutions like education institutions, we should not treat apples and oranges as same things. And I think this is very important, not to make mistakes.
Dan?
Bill, would you mind just reframing that question for me for a second?
Sure. Is there more we should be doing essentially at the present moment, at the institutional level and at the national level, to address these issues? And then how can we tackle this over the longer term?
Okay, that's a big question.
It is indeed.
So if we were to focus there's a lot to say, I'll just offer a few thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Focus for the moment on low-income students who are in early school education or middle school education. I think there's a tremendous need to help those students have access to summer learning opportunities right now. That's going to be hard because most low-income students don't have access to reliable broadband in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's really going to be hard, but there are community groups that are trying to provide students with some kind of learning experience in the summer. And then I think we should do everything possible safely to open up schools in the fall, even if we have to spend money to reconstruct the classrooms in a significant way, or even if it requires, I hope not, having students go to school in shifts or go to school on different days. We've got to get kids going back into school. If the focus is on college for a moment, there I think what's very clear is that a great many students are going to need very serious financial aid. We are already, I think, underinvesting in financial aid in the country. And I think that we face at the college level an extraordinary financial crisis in public and private colleges alike. And that the key to this is going to be getting some relief money into those schools so that they can keep their faculty employed and figure out a way to provide a hybrid experience of some students learning online and some students learning while social distancing in person. And it's exceptionally complex. And Bill, you know this as a former college president, every school has to develop its own strategy for returning to classes, whether that's in person, all online, all virtual, hybrid, sequenced. There's so many different things. Teachers that are virtual while students are spacing, but in person. So much ahead for higher education. And in that context, many low-income students are going to have additional needs besides being able to have their tuition covered, partly because their families have suffered disproportionately from the crisis, partly because they may not be able to go back to school. So I think there's almost going to also need to be a national effort to invest in certain kinds of service-oriented jobs for low-income students who want to help out but can't leave their families to go back to college right now. I know I'm talking about enormous things here. An investment in the funding to help pre-college public education function, an investment in college education in order to keep the doors open of our schools in advance of being able to have full student body return, and an investment in young people who can't go back to school having something meaningful to do and getting paid for it. You say, well, how can we afford that? And my answer to that is, how can we afford not to invest in our younger generation, in the education and optimism of our younger generation? It's not just that we're helping them develop knowledge, which we are, and skills, which we are. We're also helping the young feel that they are seen and valued by our society, and that our society understands the young as the future leaders of the country. And so I do think a national effort that says to young people, you are our priority, is extraordinarily important. But the dimension of that effort will vary depending on the community.
Dan, those are big, bold ideas, and I love them. Let me throw another big idea out at y'all. As you all know, the notion of meritocracy has really been foundational to education systems in the United States and Japan. But meritocracy, especially in college admissions, has been under attack in recent years in the US. And since the start of this pandemic, an increasing number of universities have decided no longer to use the SAT and ACT in their admissions decisions. Do you think COVID could prove fatal to the meritocratic foundations of education on both sides of the Pacific? Dan, do you want to start with that?
Okay, thank you. Big question. And let me say one thing about I think it's possible not to have required standardized tests for all students and still to have meritocracy. Not everyone will agree, but having been a college president and recruited, many classes of students at my institution, Franklin Marshall College, we did not require students to submit SAT scores and ACT scores. And the reason we didn't require it is that we had 20 years of research showing that there was no correlation between strong performance on the SAT and stronger performance academically. And we understood from research that high test scores on the SAT and the ACT correlated primarily to family income. And we really found there was a set of other metrics that we could look at that were more predictive of success in Franklin and Marshall College, which is a very rigorous school. It's like the University of Chicago of liberal arts schools, a hard school. And so you say, what are those metrics? I don't believe it. So what we looked for were grades in a college prep curriculum. We looked for demonstrated record of curiosity, of resilience in dealing with difficulties, of high motivation, and a record of saying yes to opportunity. Those were demonstrable in the application process through the essay, the recommendations, the campus visit, the interviews. And we did evaluate students' academic records. We cared about the rigor of their curriculum. And we understood that grading might be different by different standards in different schools. But on the whole, the combination of grades and strength of curriculum with those other, I'll call them metacognitive qualities, was very predictive of success. And it was on the basis of that work that we were able to reach out to low-income communities all around the country and find striving youngsters who had the grades and the right college prep curriculum, but then demonstrated those other core qualities of resilience, curiosity, drive, and a mindset to learn. And so I would argue that the diminishment of the role of the SAT and the ACT in the college application process may prove to be to help serve the cause of meritocracy rather than undermine the cause of meritocracy. And that's a controversial statement. And I will say as one last thing, I served on the board of trustees of the College Board, which runs the SAT and which also runs the AP program. And I served on it because I wanted to understand. I was invited and I wanted to understand how it worked. And I was very impressed with the quality of people that worked to develop the AP exams and the SAT. And in fact, they changed the SAT radically during the time that I was serving on the board. The CEO's name is David Coleman, and he changed the test from being essentially a test that presumed to test aptitude to instead testing achievement. It became a more fact-based test, but timed. And it still advantaged those from upper incomes in all sorts of ways, but they're trying to adapt it, and I respect that. I just think realistically, betting our belief in meritocracy on any single standardized test is not a good bet. We should look at students more holistically.
Ryohei, of course, in Japan, entrance examinations are very much at the core of the educational system. I wonder if you can talk about your perspective.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And our new program is, we're kind of trying to get rid of that kind of Japanese meritocracy entrance exam hell, we say. And well, higher education in Japan overall is classified as a single measurement. It's basically to seek efficiency in some sense. And I think that is entrance exam scores, but the system has, of course, automatically excluded the majority of those social minority groups in many sense, because you need a lot of investment beforehand from childhood until they become 17, 18. And yet there are some schools like ours are starting to find the true value of simply having diversity in our student body. But that single metrics, by using that, it's just no way, there's no way to acquire that kind of diversity in the group. And we strongly believe that maintaining diversity in the student body is important part of our learning by itself, because it simply reflects the reality of the society surrounding us. So if some schools simply seek for efficient achievers, then diversity of the student population could be a complicated issue. But for some schools like ours, it's an asset. Mm-hmm. And there are many Japanese students coming to us because our student body is diverse. And so I think the key to diversify the objectives of education among institutions in Japanese school system, I think, is very important. For some, it's a complication, but for others, it's an asset. And as our new department's slogan, we say, be a change maker. And we prioritize in our admissions, not just exams, and we do have exams still, but we prioritize having interviews. And we're trying to find the change makers who are willing to serve to the society, to be change makers. And that's what we're trying to do.
How broadly based are those changes in Japan, Ryohei? Are other schools adopting approaches like this?
There are only just, I would say, just a few. It's not as popular yet, but some schools are now implementing this kind of way of admissions.
And what is hindering change there? Is it faculty? Is it students and their families? Is it institutional culture?
I think all of them. That's my read. Because the university, the college brand image is created by something called hensachi. Hensachi is something like a statistical hierarchy that Japan's prep schools or clam schools, they issue every year, like which universities in such a statistical hierarchy, you guys are here, you guys are there. And families, test takers, students, they look at those, or high school teachers look at those scores, and they sort of decide their own schools, universities. And so all the system is already embedded. And unless everybody agrees that we need to diversify the system, it's not going to change. But there are some gradual changes, but it's taken time.
So we're getting a lot of questions from the audience, which I love. And let me encourage folks, please send in more. But a lot of people are asking about online education. Of course, online education has often been billed as being revolutionary in its potential to increase equity in education, making it accessible to large audiences. in an affordable way. Of course, in Japan, there has been some resistance to online education. A recent OECD study showed that Japanese teachers are some of the least prepared in the world in terms of educational technology. China, meanwhile, is number one. And I'm wondering, from both of your perspectives, from America and Japan, what is the potential for online learning going forward, just in general, but in terms of the equity perspective in particular?
So I loved listening to your last answer, Ryohei. I want to come visit. I want to learn about your university. And it really, you sounded like you could be talking about a university in the United States in the way that you addressed that question. I really learned a lot. Thank you. So I'll go first on this one. I think that I'm hesitant to make a blanket statement for all students about everything. I mean, I think that online education is proven to be helpful and empowering to many learners, depending on the context and the role it's supposed to play. So if you say to me, do I think online education can be a way to supplement students' learning and whet their curiosity? Absolutely. I love the idea that students can go on to Khan Academy and for free build their skills, or that they can get into college courses that are lectures, but are free on topics ranging from string theory to Shakespeare to the sort of nuclear power around the world. I mean, these incredible topics. So that's very important. I do believe, though, that education is about the growth of the human being and not simply the transfer of knowledge. And so if you think of it, even in terms of the transfer of knowledge, a lot's missing when you're not in discussion. But the growth of the human, I just think that we need proximity to one another. We need to connect to one another. We need to engage and develop our, all of our faculties of perception. And that comes from being in relation to one another. And in fact, if all of our lives are organized so that we're not in relation to one another, then how do we learn to be citizens? And how do we learn to be social beings? So there's that. Then for the low-income students, it won't be equitable to offer online education as their primary way of being educated. Why do I say that? First of all, because broadband access is deeply, deeply limited in America for low-income students. And secondly, because low-income students need to leave their homes and go to school settings, sometimes for other services, including food, in the case of many students in America. And third, many students studying at home will have parents that either aren't home or have to do their jobs from home. So I don't see how that works. I think developmentally it would be catastrophic for young people. And then on top of that, I think it's also the case that upper income people will never say, well, my child will be educated primarily in an online experience. Don't tell me that. Upper income people and upper middle income people are going to send their children to schools that see and engage them as an individual person, full of potential. They're not going to give them a one-dimensional education that's sort of like pouring information into the hard drive of a laptop or something. So that's my thoughts about it. I think there's a role for it, though. I don't mean to dismiss it. I think it can help students supplement in-person learning, and it can certainly democratize access to information around the world. And so there's much to want to see developed.
Ryohei?
Okay, thank you. So when it comes to the question from Bill about Japanese teachers not really accepting the online education, I don't have a straight answer to that, actually. But my read is that Japanese teachers, starting from primary school, junior high and high school, maybe university teachers also, they're all just too busy and too also worried about making mistakes in many ways. Especially, for example, like my wife is teaching in the local elementary school, and so I know the industry in primary schools also. And teachers are super busy working until midnight, and they're also so afraid of making mistakes. They're sort of like kind of controlled by of course, their bosses and the central, but also they're also afraid of the parents. In Japan, we call them monster parents. I hear in the United States, you call them like helicopter parents. And so that has something to do with the parents as well, and that is sort of making teachers not being able to shift the way they change their education. They have no time to think about any alternatives. I think that's the reality. Well, gradually, there some high-tech things are kind of coming to classrooms as well, but it's taking time for sure. And just like Dan has said, I think the online education itself, I'm facing also a real problem online during the class hours. We need them physically in classrooms, present. And I consider online education is supposed to be a supplementary thing, particularly when it comes to learning about diversity. I'm just repeating the same thing. Because students learn from, like, let's say 5 senses, or maybe from 6 senses in some sense. And not only from eyes and ears. I understand that technology is allowing us to fill the gap, but there's a limit. My assumption is that even if international student migration can be limited because of the situation, I think like colleges, like in Japan at least, of course in the United States, can still focus on embracing diversity from within our own societies. And there's still many social minority groups in Japan anyway. I hope I'm answering to the question.
That's perfect. Thank you. We have so many good questions. We have enough for another webinar here, I think. A lot of folks are interested in inequality in the elementary and middle school and high school system in Japan, especially since the funding system for that education is very different from the United States. Of course, in America, it is based on local school districts and your local tax base, whereas in Japan, it tends to be a more equitable funding system across the country. So what, Ryohei, does it look like in Japan?
Yes, they're both public, private, and national. Public meaning like prefectural or city-based, and private. So there are there are hybrids of education system in Japan, and the funding system it is yes, it's centralized, and it's under the helicopter of the Ministry of Education. But each prefecture and each city, basically, the jurisdiction, they have their own something like an education committee within their local governments. And teachers like human resource management, all those things, and other budgets, and also they are sort of basically controlled by those prefectural and jurisdiction-based control. I hope I'm answering to the question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, do you think this has produced more equitable results in Japan?
Thank you. I would say yes, until recently. Mm-hmm. I mean to say this because there is stronger difference between maybe many of the private schools versus public schools. And until recently, the private schools have gone very far in terms of, as we discussed, the metrics. Many students, they have higher score in many ways. So those private school, high school students go to better universities for sure. And well, recently the government has sort of is also trying to sort of leverage the public schools as well. So some of them are also catching up, but there, of course, the variety of those public schools are very much wider. So in terms of equity, the government is trying hard to sort of to fill the gap, but in general, in the past, let's say several decades, it's widening for sure.
One of the things I was just thinking about, I'm learning so much. And these questions too, I just read them. They're amazing. The questioners should be the speakers. It's fantastic. But yeah, I've still been thinking a little bit about that distance learning a little bit, or the online learning, because of course we're exchanging right now via the medium of the internet, and it's wonderful. And so there is that upside of potential for cross-cultural communication that couldn't be achieved in another way. The ASP Institute does a lot of work. We have all these online programs or relationships between U.S. schools and schools in the Middle East and North Africa. And that's really wonderful. I don't want to neglect the value of that, because as an organization, you're all about cross-cultural exchange. And so we should be trying to achieve that every way we can.
Thanks so much. We could go on with these questions forever. There really is so much interesting stuff, so many policy issues, so many people who obviously care a lot about this. I really want us to get to a point at the end here where we can look forward and where we can think a little bit about the role that all of us can play in driving some meaningful change going forward. It really seems to me that we may have reached a tipping point, at least in American education, and that tweaking the system and incremental change is not going to be enough going forward, and that this has very much been accelerated by the protests on America's streets, and I think a much deeper and more sincere realization that we have to address social and racial inequity in America more seriously. What can we do? Okay, what can we, from students and teachers, people in the community, other stakeholders in education, do to imagine the possibilities of more equitable systems of education going forward?
I'll give one answer, because you alluded, Bill. The U.S. system of public education is based on a formula by which schools are funded through the property taxes that the communities are able to levy upon themselves. And that is fundamentally, by definition, inequitable. I mean, that's not an opinion now, that's a fact. It's inequitable on a year-by-year basis, but it's also inequitable over time because the inequities compound. So I think that is, in the U.S. context, segregation based on income as well as race and ethnicity, but certainly based on income for sure, it's built into the system, is a major driver of all kinds of other inequities, because children for generations happen to have been born in the wrong zip code, aren't getting a sustained investment in their education the same way. There's important questions about curricula, about standards, about teacher quality, many important issues, but I think that we have to acknowledge the U.S. system is built on a model of inequity, and go from there. And then I also would like to offer a feeling, something around for hope here, because if you look at America's low-income communities, whether they're immigrant communities and newcomers, or communities where it's been generational poverty, urban or rural, everybody wants the best for their children. Mm-hmm. Everyone does. And everyone believes that education is the fundamental food by which you nourish a growing young person. Everybody believes that. We're not debating about whether education is good or not. Everybody wants it for their children. So it's just a matter of organizing ourselves to deliver it more equitably.
Well, thank you. Well, let me first start with Japan. The society as a whole, I think Japan must look into the realities of, again, the misconceptions of being in a ethnically homogeneous community. But what I'm concerned the most is that the society as a whole in Japan would not acknowledge the surfacing realities of those social minority groups and fend it off at the time of like a situation like the corona. Because under such a turbulent environment right now, people tend to become inward looking and segregate between us and them. But the reality, of course, is that for example, like Brazilians and Filipinos in Japan, they're just some of them, are no longer them anymore. They're now already an important part of us. And we actually invited them to work in Japan. And now people in Japan have to learn from the societal challenges in the United States and reflect back to our own societies, looking at the protests and other things going on. I think the true lesson of what's happening right now in the United States is when it becomes like fragile and life and death situation, like the past several months, society cannot survive, I think, or cannot sustain by shouldering such thing like discrimination. And we have to learn from our neighbors. Thank you very much.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Ryohei. Dan, I can't tell you how meaningful your comments here were. These were some really big ideas, some bold ideas, but it's a moment when we need that kind of ambition to tackle these really persistent problems. Thanks so much for being with us. Thank you to the audience. This was an incredibly involved group of people. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the literally dozens of questions that came in. I want to give a big thank you to USJC for making this event possible, for convening us, and especially to Maya Fisher, whose brainchild this webinar was. And now let me turn it back to Suzanne Basala for some final words.
Thank you so much, Bill, for your excellent moderating of this discussion and for all you and Dr. Maya Fisher did to bring this webinar together. Professor Nakagawa, Dr. Porterfield, thank you for your perspectives and for your specific actions that we can take away from this discussion. We all have a stake in addressing the inequalities in education, and today's webinar is a critical contribution to that dialogue. On behalf of the US-Japan Council, I hope you have found it worthwhile to attend today's event, and I thank you for participating. I truly hope that we can keep this critical conversation going after we leave the webinar. Now I'll turn it back over to Maya to conclude.
Thank you, Suzanne. Again, I want to thank our speakers for their service on today's panel and their willingness to tackle this complex and critical issue. Thanks to all of you who attended, and especially those of you who posed questions to the panel. I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to all of your questions. There were so many, more than 30. But you know what? That just means the discussion is not over. We need to continue challenging and thinking about how to address inequality. We need to be willing to have these difficult and complex conversations that are often uncomfortable. We hope that you all continue to use your voices to speak against inequality, particularly in education. And if you enjoyed this webinar or want to see more programming like this, we encourage you to visit our website and make a tax-deductible donation to the US-Japan Council. There will also be a short survey following the end of the webinar where we would like your feedback and suggestion of other topics you might want us to address with programming in the future. Again, thank you very much for your time, and good night.